Hey everyone, so while I'm driving, I thought I would give a little intro to the next part of the series of the laws of success. And then this part is called A Man's Worth. And I really want to get into more, detail about, you know, where a man's identity lies. I've heard it plenty of times in my walk where I've heard people say that who they are is their occupation and what they do. And so when, they lose their jobs, it's like their job and their self worth is tied together. So if they lose their jobs, then they think that they have nothing to live for, which is why, there's issues of suicides. A man doesn't feel like he can provide for his family, so he feels like he's of no use to his family anymore. It's like that movie Sling Blade. I've said that plenty of times in my other videos, but the point is true, is that this is what men deal with every day in their lives. How many women also deal with the same issue? So, um, the movie Sling Blade, a little boy was talking about his dad and how his dad killed himself because he felt like he couldn't provide for his family. And the little boy said, "I thought he took care of us fine." So, the identity and a man's self-worth, since he has chosen to become the source for his family rather than God. And this is why this thinking is not right. Because a man can't do more than what he can. You know, I don't want to get into more detail than that yet, but I just want to give like this little intro while I'm driving. And if I get a delivery, you're going to hear it in this video, which you probably just heard one of the deliveries pop up. But sometimes I don't take them because some people want you to go drive like 10 miles total, which I just saw. 10 miles for $3. That doesn't even, that only covers less than 1 gallon of gas. And I'm not about to do that, so I don't take orders like that because, I got to fill my tank too. If I had a good amount of money, then most likely I would take those orders. But, as it is now, I don't make that much. So, I got to reserve my cash for local deliveries, deliveries that are at most 3 miles. So, getting back to the point, man's self-worth and his occupation seem like they go hand in hand. And it's never meant to be that way. That's not what God intended for us. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were one with God. They had full relationship with him, but they chose to listen to the serpent. And so therefore separation from God came into play. Man chose for himself. Man became the source for his family. And, that's where, the fall came from. When you think about the fall, a lot of people think about sin, but, I think it's more than sin. We fell from a place of relationship with God where God was our source for everything. God took care of our needs. There was no issues in relationship with him. We lived for years. But then, we chose to sever our relationship with God. And unfortunately, Christians still walk in that place of separation. And so, let's see, what do I got here? Let me pause the video. So I accepted the delivery. So while I'm on my way to pick up the order, I figure I would try and finish this intro. But like I said, Adam and Eve chose to listen to that serpent and chose to do things on their own. Choose to follow their own way apart from God. Dealing with sin and then being subjected to the results of sin and, just the pain in itself. So, men to this day are still walking in that separation with God. As I had said in many other videos, there's that Romans chapter 3 scripture that says no one seeks God. No one seeks God when they're so focused on this world, what they got to do. No one is going to ask God, Lord, what do you want me to do? Well, man doesn't have that in him because man is toiling. And really, that's really the point of all these videos that I make, is really to expose this thinking. This is stuff that I have thought about, after I surrendered my life to God. I'm working on the books, and, I think about certain areas. I think about what I dealt with in this world. And I use personal experiences and the stuff that I've seen from other people. And, stuff that was said to me, stuff that was said to them. So I bring it all together because it applies. This is all the stuff that I said is exactly what I've heard and what I have experienced. And, the point of these videos is to expose this thinking, to get Christians back into that relationship with God so they know whether or not they're following the world or they're following Jesus. If you're following the world, don't you want that to change? Do you want to continue walking with chains bound to you? Why bother walking like that? Who would like the movie Scrooge? Bob Marley had those chains around him, and those chains were what he built with, his love of money, his despising of the poor, not helping the poor. And after he was bound with those chains, he said, my life should have been about helping the poor, being there for my fellow man. And he came there to warn Scrooge not to do what he's doing, or he will end up in the same, I guess you could say, the same burdens. But Marley said that Scrooge's was even worse than his if he continued down that path. So, this is what men are living in every day. And so I really, in these videos, I want to help break the chains that have men so bound. And, if these chains are broken, then we can walk unfettered with God, doing what we need to do. That's, God led me to write those books that I wrote, for the very purpose of encouraging my brothers and sisters, to have a reminder about what God has done and what God's done in my life, provisional wise. So I'm about to pick up this order, and I will continue when I'm done. So I have my delivery. So I will start the video while I'm driving. Let me just state that, I I've heard, since my rest in God had begun, I've heard, different men say that their identity was in what they did, their occupation. Now, identity, anybody asks me who I am, my name is Rob. I know my parents. I know what family I was born into. I can't see someone saying, hey, John, what's your identity? And then him giving them his occupation. But apparently, that's what men do. Their occupation is what they do. Their identity to them is exactly what they do in this world, their jobs. I've heard that from several brothers, in the church, that your job is your identity. And whether they know it or not, they're speaking in itself bondage. And I already gave the example of, the effect, the outcome of that thinking. And so, I know my identity. I know what family I was born into. You go to, if a police pulls you over, you give them your license, and you give them your registration. Why give them your license? Well, it has your name on it, your address. It doesn't show your occupation. So, I think about, what did I put? I put that show Home Improvement, one of my favorite shows. I think it's funny. A lot of good and funny stuff in it. But this particular show, if you've seen it, Tim invited his shop teacher on his show. And, his shop teacher, when you shook his hand, he would crush it because of the strength in it. But because he became older, he developed arthritis in his hand. And so he wasn't able to grip like he used to. So since he invited his shop teacher on his show, he invited also other past students of this teacher, in which, this teacher affected them in such a positive way that they, without question, went on the show just to be with their teacher. And so, they had to make a toolbox. And in order to do that, they would have to cut, I guess it was sheet metal. So, his teacher was trying to cut the metal, but because of his arthritis, he couldn't. He couldn't grip. He couldn't, cut the metal. And so, he puts down, I guess you would say the tin snips, I guess that you would call it, the scissors that would cut metal. He put it down, and he was going to get back to it. And so Tim went into his, cut for him. And his teacher got angry with him. But it wasn't really angry toward him. I think it was angry toward himself, because he wasn't the man he thought, he used to be. And so Tim, felt so bad, and he said to his wife, I broke the cardinal rule of men, stating that, he's not a man anymore because he helped the shop teacher. He said that if a boulder fell on a man, his wife said to him, Jill, said, if a boulder fell on a man, you wouldn't help him out. And Tim's like, no, because, men got to deal with it themselves. And she's like, she was just saying just how ridiculous that statement was. And so, Tim went to go talk with Wilson, his neighbor, and, Tim was trying to relay, what men think every day, about, their jobs are who they are. And he says to Wilson, Wilson says to him that, this world defines men by what they do. And saying something like it's a burden to them. And then Tim's like, I don't think it's a burden. I like being Tim the Tool Man. And then Wilson's like, what if you can't be Tim the Tool Man anymore? And Tim's like, oh man, I don't know what I would do. And so Wilson ends up speaking life into him, speaking positive about what's really important. And I'll get into that probably at the close if I can remember, because it's very important that we remember these things. So, with men, his job is what defines him. Is it his life? Is it his worth? And I'll have to finish once I deliver. So, in case I didn't say it, let me reiterate what I had wrote. His job is who he is, and it defines him. It's his life, his worth, his use is based on what he brings to the table. Society judges someone by what they do and their looks. I mean, how many times we've seen that in this world where someone is judged by what they look like? I recall an old church I went to. This man came in, this elderly man, and he had a suit on. And he had a belt that was made out of a rope. And of course he was poor. And so, the world judges somebody, somebody that has tattered clothes, old tattered clothes, then immediately the world comes up with a judgment that they're poor, they're lazy. It reminds me of, let me start my driving. It reminds me of the time I went to a business college, for graphic design, and one of the courses were, helping you get the job you want. And of course I learned in that course, you gotta do cold calling and stuff for jobs, but I've learned in itself that there's nothing you really can do if the doors aren't opening for jobs. And so we had one test to where, it was testing businesses. I dressed up in a nice suit and my friend wore tattered clothes, dirty and tattered clothes. We went to, what was it? Like a table in the mall in which cosmetics were being sold, or fragrances, colognes, or whatever. So him and I went to the cologne area, and we went there at the same time. So who do you think was served first? Well, they came to me because I wore a suit. So it just shows you, this is society, what society bases their judgments on. And then similarly, equal judgment is based, on the job that you have. If you have a mediocre job, then you are judged by this world as lazy and not ambitious, and you need to be corrected because you're not with your path, you're not following in line with the mold of the ideal man. You're not pursuing success. And so let's say if you have you're a CEO of a job, you're like up there, man. You're like, you're what everybody would flock to. And so this is the judgment of the world. And if you remember what, Samuel had said to God, about David, And God said to him, don't consider his size or his age. The Lord doesn't see men as we see them. The Lord looks at the heart. And, how far are we away from God's opinion, the opinion that we should have with God? We should be one and the same with him, in agreement. But unfortunately, we don't stand in agreement with God. We're walking in the same pattern we always walked in. And that's, Mammon's way of thinking. So your value in this world is based upon your occupation, your job. Like the example of the judgment in the mall. My friend, his value was lowered in the eyes of the person that, came to me to help me first because of what I look like. And so, people decrease your value in this world. I think about this world. I mean, you look up, the net worth of an actor. And there, many are like in the millions and stuff like that. But somebody like me, what would my net worth be? Well, it's basically what I have in my account, which is like what, $20. So in this world, I'm nothing. And of course, this is what men have learned in this world. This is what men strive for every day. To be what this world wants them to be, to raise their value in the eyes of people. So since this world bases the value of somebody by their occupation and what they do, of course, this has come in the thinking of so many people throughout the years. It's in the opinions of parents who, teach their daughters along the lines. It's in the parents that teach their sons what they got to do in this world to be prepared for marriage and stuff like that, to have lofty goals they need to set for themselves, and it's frowned on them to pick such a mediocre job. You got to get something better. And, it's in the mind of so many men and women in this world that, how am I going to make it with so little pay? I have to get, a high paying job. I have to set lofty goals for myself. I mean, from a human standpoint, it's understandable. But this is the life that so many people live without God in mind. God is virtually non-existent in their thoughts. No one seeks God. So if you don't seek God, you're not going to seek his ways and what he wants you to do. So since the value is placed on a man by what he does, occupation-wise, or by his job, and you're judged based upon what kind of job you have, then that is the most important in people's minds, in their eyes. If you have a good paying job, then, you're free of judgment and criticism. But if you don't have a good paying job, then your value in their eyes has decreased. And so you could be the most nicest person in this world. You could have qualities of Jesus, but those are dismissed when your job is not good, when your occupation is not good. Like I had said, you're decreased in the value of both men and women. You're decreased in the value of your family. You could be following what God wants you to do, but if your job isn't any good, then, you're nothing to them. You're refuse. You're like trash. And so, let me look at the next point. As a personal example, I look at my own life, what God has called me to. Close to the time that I had surrendered my will, I was dealing with criticism from both family and friends. And so I reluctantly went up to visit family in another state. And I didn't want to go because, man, I already knew what the criticism was I was going to face. And so I went, and, here I'm there, I'm working on, I think it was my second book, Undefiled Faith. And a family member comes in, and he more or less said, we brought you here to straighten you out. Because they thought that what I was doing for God wasn't right because I didn't have, quote unquote, a job. How can you explain to the world spiritual things? I know what God has called me to. He called me to that place of rest so I can learn to trust Him, to reveal that to the world. And so he come in there, and I'm trying to explain spiritual things to somebody that's, doesn't think that way. Because it says in Scripture, the man without the Spirit does not understand the things that come from the Spirit of God, because they are foolishness to them, and they can't accept them because they are spiritually discerned. So this is exactly what I was dealing with in conversation with this family member. They were dismissing everything that I was saying. They refused to hear me. And so I couldn't really talk to them. One second, I got to find the address to this house. Sometimes it's hard to see the addresses. So, I'm here trying to explain spiritual things to my cousin, and he refused to listen to me. And so, anything I was saying, about Elijah and what God had done through him, he just shook his head, like, I was off my rocker. But you know what? And of course, to him, my value was lowered. I wasn't worth anything to him, which is really sad. But, if I was a CEO of a company, then I would be looked up to from my family. So I'm going to find this address. One second. So you could have the best qualities in the world, but those are dismissed when your job isn't any good. So the meaningful is overlooked. One second. So this value system that the world uses, where is it based from? Is it based from a place of love? Or is it based from the world? Is it from the heart of God, or is it from the world? Is the value seen for somebody through the eyes of God or through mammon? Really dissecting that thinking really can bring you to the answer of it. What are some of the things that would be said to somebody whose job, is mediocre? For somebody who is not living according to the world's ways of doing things. What is said? Now, we know God is a God of love. We know God accepts us. We know God, of course, loves us. He doesn't criticize us. He doesn't reject us. He doesn't devalue us when we may not do what he wants us to do. What parent would do that with a child? That when the child doesn't do what the parent wants, what the parent devalues them? Not at all. So with a clue right there, you can actually see which opinion these people have toward anybody and what their value system is based on. Sorry, traffic's a little crazy right now. So since man is devalued when he doesn't have a good paying job, his man has been decreased in the eyes of people, and his use is only what he brings to the table. If you can't bring anything to the table, then who you are is no longer looked at. It's what you do that matters in the eyes of people. And so if you can't bring anything to the table, then a man feels like he's of no use to anybody. His worth is gone in the eyes of everyone. People think he has a very low opinion. People think of him as, trash. And that's what he thinks in his mind, because this is what society has put on the shoulders of man as the breadwinner. And so, it gets to that point of the little boy in that Sling Blade movie where his father killed himself. How many suicides happened because man felt like he failed his family? Because his use to them was only his job. And this is the thinking that man has grown accustomed to. This is the thinking man has always had, from the time that it began. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to see what my next points are. All right, let's see. It's something with, the issue of suicide, when you're in that place of depression, it's so easy to have those thoughts. They think the worst at that moment, and who knows what's happening in the spiritual realm with these demons that are circling around them, speaking lies into their ears. They think the negative, and that's what the enemy wants. And so the man ends up thinking that, his family is better off without them. Why? Because his value system. He thinks his value system isn't worth anything. How many spouses decrease their value of their spouse because of job loss? You would really... I watched that movie Courageous, and it's a good movie, but what irritates me is the woman, the Spanish lady, she's all worried about, her husband finding a job and stuff like that, and it adds unneeded burden on his shoulders. Instead of lifting him up, she was actually doing the opposite. She was putting more stress on him. Oh, so what are we going to do? We have these bills due, and we got rent due and stuff like that. And is that helping him whatsoever? Is it building him up? How about praying for him? So, she's all stressful and stuff like that. And when he ends up getting a good paying job, that is when her burden stopped. And then she started speaking life into him once he had that job. And I'm sorry, but that really irritated me, watching those scenes. Because I know what this world lives by every day. And it's like Christians are stuck in that thinking. And it's a thinking that has really taken Christians off the path that God intends for them. Because they're not walking like they should faith-wise in what God can do. And, it's hard for me, to watch those scenes in that movie because I know where that thinking usually ends up. So, getting back to that point with home improvement, Wilson said to him, "What if you can't be Tim the Tool Man anymore?" And Tim was like, "Oh man, I don't know what I would do." But Wilson brought home the point to Tim, showing him what was really important. He said, "You're a good husband. You're a good father. You're a good neighbor." He was showing him all the positive, what was really meaningful. And he said, "You need to satisfy yourself with being Tim the man." He wasn't pointing out his occupation to him. He was pointing out who he was, Tim the man. What was really, meaningful. What should be meaningful to his family, to everyone around him. And, Tim went to tell his shop teacher that. He said to him, you're more than what you do. And Tim tells him the meaningful. He says, when I told all your shop class that I was going to have you on my show, they jumped and they lined up to want to, be with you because you were the one person that spoke life into them. And it brought home to the shop teacher what was important. It lifted his spirits up. And so, how meaningful would it be for each of us if somebody spoke life into us, rather than the critical words that this world lives by every day? So I am already at the 40-minute mark in this video, and I don't think I can go on any longer. I'm going to have to upload this video because I don't want the video to cut off. So this is going to be part 1, and then I'm going to start part 2. If not today, maybe tomorrow. It depends. But I pray part 1 of this video has blessed you. I really hope this series really blesses you. Really shows you what's really meaningful. Really, through God, I hope that it has pointed out the flaws in the world's thinking, to let people know, what's going on, what people are overlooking, what people have never thought of. And I really pray that everything that I'm speaking of exposes the world's thinking for what it is, so that Christians can walk in the complete opposite of what is being told them, and to shed away all the garbage that they've learned. So thank you for taking the time to watch, and I'm going to be uploading part 2 soon.